how do we get our message that we feel like God's called us to share seen or heard by as many people as possible. I believe in the power of the niche, or as my British friends say, the niche. Stop trying to be the best in the world at what you do. Don't be the best pastor in the world. Don't be the best film director in the world. Because the problem is, there's millions of them out there you're competing with. If you really want to get noticed, try to be extraordinary in a small, narrow niche.
Welcome to our Lead Like Jesus podcast, where we'll inspire and equip you, regardless of your title or position, to influence and lead others by following the greatest leader of all time, and that is Jesus. And this is Karen Conley, and I am so glad to be here for part 2 of our interview with Phil Cook. If for some reason you missed our last podcast, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to that. I had an opportunity to introduce Phil. Phil is someone that brings such experience and vision to the world that we're speaking to Christian leaders throughout this country. He's internationally known as a writer and speaker and has been in the media industry as the owner of Cook Pictures. And Phil, thank you so much for coming back for part 2.
I'm thrilled to be here. This was part 1 was too much fun. Let's do this again.
Well, really, as I started going through your books, I started thinking every single one of these, I have so many different questions about, and think that you have hit on a variety of topics that really are relevant to all believers. And I'm excited to be able to dive in on a couple different topics. I think what we'll focus our time on today is that whole topic of relevance. We touched on it in our last podcast towards the end, and you talked about the right tool for the right job being the definition of relevance. So whether someone we're talking to is a business owner or a ministry leader or just someone wanting to make a positive impact in this culture, why do they need to care about relevance?
Well, if you're trying to reach an audience, you want to use every tool. I can tell you as an advertising person, as a media person, if you're serious about reaching an audience, you have to get on their wavelength. I don't care if you're selling toilet paper or if you're selling cars or if you're preaching the gospel or whatever it is you're doing. If you want people to actually listen to your message. And by the way, Karen, today we happen to live in the most cluttered, disrupted culture in the history of the world. Some research indicates that people are being bombarded with about 5,000 media messages every single day. I was at a hotel in Dallas the other day that had video monitors in the elevator. I got gas here in L.A. the other day, and there were video monitors embedded in the gas pump. I mean, you cannot escape the latest news about Kim Kardashian. We're literally being overwhelmed with media messages. So it's more important than ever that if you have a message that you want people to hear, that message cuts through all that clutter, all that competition to get to its target audience. And so relevance becomes a part of that equation. I mean, truthfully, if I'm using King James English, people are just not going to pay attention to me anymore. If I'm speaking in Chinese and I'm in France, nobody's going to care. So we have to start thinking about who our audience is. How should we be reaching them? You know, an earlier generation thought, all I need to do is preach the gospel. If I'm just sharing the Bible, preaching the gospel, that's all it takes. Well, obviously, God can do miraculous things. He can open doors. He can make people listen. But the truth is, there's something we need to do, and I think we need to be where the people are. If you study the life of Jesus, and I don't mean to rant about this, but I think you're onto something really significant. If you study the life of Jesus, he spent his life where the people were. In those days, it was in the marketplace or the temple square. He wanted to be where the people were. That's what we have to do today. Now, today, the people are on social media. The people are in movie theaters. The people are watching television or online. We have to be thinking about how we speak that language if we're going to get our message heard. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting as you gave that statistic of 5,000 media messages per day. Back in 2012, I was doing some research for the book that I wrote, Miss Perfect. One of the things that I was talking about as women try to find their identity, they often look in all of the wrong places. And some of the statistics back in 2012 were 3,000 media messages per day. And honestly, I think I can see, even in that short window of time, that it's very possible that that explosion in media has happened. We really are bombarded by that many per day.
I read a study last week that said when you meet somebody for the first time, you make the decision about whether you like that person or not within the first 5 to 7 seconds. So in that case, I don't care how wonderful you are. I don't care how great your message is. I don't care what you're trying to share or how much you're trying to help that person. If they make their decision in the first 5 to 7 seconds, that initial perception of you becomes really, really critical. So we're simply not paying attention to some of the key ways to share the gospel with people if we're not concerned about being relevant in this generation.
Phil, you do consulting work. I'm assuming by the time someone brings you in that they may know that they need some help in that. But how does a ministry or a business leader, maybe that's listening to this, maybe they own a business, how do they know when it's time to really reinvent themselves or to change their message, or how do they know whether they're relevant or not?
Great question. Sometimes, Karen, we've been called when sales hit a plateau, or in a nonprofit sense, one major ministry called us when they just felt like they'd hit a plateau with their donors, with people watching them, keep tracking them through the media, the response to their fundraising campaigns. Sometimes it's hitting a plateau, hitting a wall like that. Other times you feel like, you know what, we're not appearing in the news, nobody's talking about us, the buzz has disappeared about who we are and what we're doing. Sometimes you just feel that the expression of what you do is tired, whether it's your logo, whether it's your advertising, whether it's your website. I can tell you that virtually 100% of new visitors, potential visitors, people who are thinking about coming to your church, will check you out on the web first. So I always ask pastors, why is your website so lame? In today's world, if virtually 100% of potential visitors are checking you out on the web first, your website suddenly becomes the most important thing you do. So if it's tired, if it's dated, if it's not relevant, or if it's not updated or accurate, it's time to start changing. So those are some of the reasons we've gone in, and I think a lot of leaders are more savvy than they probably think. A lot of leaders can tell when things are kind of getting old, we've lost our buzz, we've lost our excitement about what we do. It's interesting. We had a meeting last week with a ministry organization in the Southeast. They realized there were 2 other organizations nearby them in the community that does something very, very similar to them. And so their question to me was, how do we stand out? How do we become unique? How do we get noticed? Why would people pick us over donating or working with these 2 other organizations? And I think that's a big question. In a world where there's so much competition and so much clutter, how do you stand out or rise above everybody else? Those are all big questions that you need to be asking.
And when you go into an organization, what do you find tend to be the biggest barriers to change? Change. That's that dreaded word. It's interesting. When I wrote my book, Jolt, I read a study that indicated that something like within 2 years, 50% of open heart surgery patients go back to the old lifestyle, the same lifestyle that got them to that surgery in the first place. And so I realized that if the threat of death doesn't make you change, what in the world will? I think change is one of the hardest things in the world, and it's one of the things that most organizations we work struggle with, because particularly it's difficult if you were very successful years ago. We went into a ministry not long ago that was extraordinarily successful in the 80s. Well, they've been declining and declining and declining. And they keep thinking, well, if I go back and do what I did in the 80s, it'll work. But they've got to realize culture changes, people change, trends change, styles change, communication has changed. And so we can't keep doing the same old thing over and over. It's just going to not get us really anywhere. And so I see that. I also see a lot of silos, really a common issue, a challenge in a lot of organizations, are people they've gotten frustrated, so they've set up their own little kingdoms in their department. And so very often I'll go into a nonprofit organization or even a church or ministry. There's different departments. They don't talk to each other. They don't speak to each other. They're not communicating the same message into the community. And it's just all chaos and confusion. So those are probably 2 of the biggest things. And our goal is to try to break through that, make people realize that, look, this is life or death. This is not an issue you should be playing around with anymore, because either you're going to be vibrant and move forward, or you're going to fail. And so many churches, ministries, nonprofit organizations today are on that path to eventual failure. Maybe a businessman or woman are listening right now, and let's say they're in their 50s. A lot has changed in the last 20 years when it comes to platform and how you would brand yourself and all of those things. Is the answer always to bring younger people in, or is there a way for a small business owner or a small ministry owner, maybe they have a nonprofit, to be able to make that transition if they're at that stage of life or they're there from that generation of learning?
Well, that's a great question. I often joke that when my computer breaks, I don't look for a technician. I look for a 12-year-old because they probably can fix it better than anybody else. And we're seeing studies that indicate that when toddlers look at a traditional paper photograph and they look at a picture, the first thing they do is put their thumb and their forefinger on it and try to zoom in. It's like this generation is just born with a DNA to understand technology, and they get how it works. However, we can't forget that the largest demographic group in the United States is baby boomers, which are rapidly moving into retirement. In fact, I read something the other day that the single biggest selling market segment in the country for iPhones are senior citizens. So also senior citizens are the largest donors to nonprofit organizations, churches, and ministries. A typical donor to a nonprofit these days is a 55 and older woman, for instance. So there's no question that this obsession we have very often with trying to reach younger audiences, obviously there's value. Obviously you want to reach the next generation. But we can't forget that there's a massive number of older people out there that we want to reach. We want to have as customers. If you're a business person, you want to have as customers. So don't feel like that because you're getting older, you need to be moving to the fringe of your organization or checking out. I was involved in a radio production not long ago, a radio show, and the woman that produced it was an 85-year-old radio producer who drives a convertible Corvette. And I thought, I want to be like her. At 85, I want to be her. And she was very vibrant. She comes in the office every day. She's brilliantly creative. But part of it is because she stays in touch with what's happening. I think if I would say anything to older listeners, do stay in touch with a changing culture. Understand what's going out there. Even if you're not comfortable with social media, maybe dip your toe in the water. Try it out. Play around with a Facebook page or a Twitter feed or Instagram just to see what it's like. Don't feel pressure or the obligation that you have to do it. But I think in many cases, once you experiment and play around with it, you'll really enjoy it, and it'll open up huge possibilities.
That's terrific advice, and you're right. It's important to see the entire demographics of our country in marketing and advertising, so that's a great point that I hadn't really thought of. Let me just give you a practical example. We're here on behalf of Lead Like Jesus, which has had a tremendous ministry. You listed a few minutes ago a couple of different components that an organization would have to consider if they're looking at their brand and their image. What would you tell Lead Like Jesus, for example, if we were to dissect it and advise us how to reach a younger audience? What are the things that you tell companies to do these days, or what are the different media-related aspects that would need to be considered?
Well, when we talk about a brand, that's kind of the trendy term that we talk about these days. And when I wrote my book, Unique, Telling Your Story in the Age of Brands and Social Media, it was really designed for the question you just asked. For people that are struggling with that, thinking, should we update, should we brand, what is our identity in this business, in this community? That was what my book Unique is really all about. And the big question I talk about in there is a brand is really a story that surrounds you, and everybody has one. It's a perception. In this world of so many options, I have 500 channels on my cable. It takes me an average of 2 to 3 seconds to decide what channel to watch. In this world of unlimited options, your story suddenly matters because that perception people have of you becomes incredibly important, particularly if, as I said earlier, it takes 5 to 7 seconds to decide whether I like you or not. Suddenly that first perception, the question I ask is, what do people think of when they think of you? So the first question we want to discuss is, when it comes to Lead Like Jesus, what do people think of when they think of Lead Like Jesus? What do they think of that organization? What's their perception out there? Because even though we can't always change it because it's in their mind, not ours, we can influence it. There are things we can do to try to make your story more vibrant, more accurate, more compelling, the kind of story that people would want to get behind. I think that's really important. And one caution I would say is, your logo is not your brand. Too many people think if I redesign my logo, I've got a new brand. The logo is the visual expression of your brand. The first thing we always do when we sit down with a business or sit down with a ministry or nonprofit or church is to figure out what that story is we want to tell. What is unique about us? What would make us really compelling out there in the marketplace or in the community? Once we figure that story, then we want to design a logo. In fact, we want every expression of our ministry, our organization, or our business to tell that story. So trust me, it needs to trickle down to everybody. I always tell people in the case of a church, I don't care how awesome the pastor is, I don't care how anointed the service is, I don't care how wonderful the worship is. If a new visitor walks up and meets a grumpy usher, that's their perception they're going to have of your church. So it has to trickle down to everybody in the organization so that no matter who people meet, how they come into contact with the organization, they hear that same story, and it's a compelling, powerful story. So that message, that story you're sharing, that's where we start, and I think that's the most important component. The thing is, Karen, once you figure that out, then it solves your social media, it solves your online world or your website problems, other things you're trying to do, because you want to aim all your guns in the direction of that story so that you're all telling the same story.
Well, that is a terrific practical example, and I think anybody that's listening to this, very transferable to your own business, your own nonprofit, your own ministry, of some places to start and think. And obviously, this is something that you do, and if we were going to refer people to your website at the end, if they want advice from you, that's something that you have been successful at and offer a great perspective to businesses. We've been talking that there are so many different options out there, just this onslaught of media images. What is the best way for you to build your platform but stay out of the clutter?
If you want to be a speaker, or if you want to get noticed in your business or your community, if you want to kind of create a platform for yourself, it's not about ego, by the way. Let me say this, Karen. It's not about ego. When it comes to you or Chris or me or someone else, whether it's John Maxwell or Steve Jobs or whoever, it's not really about raging ego. It's about the fact that we feel like we have a message we want to share with the world. Steve Jobs felt like he wanted to change the way people use computers and digital technology. It may be you want to share an idea God's given you. Whatever the message is, that's what building a platform is about. So it's not about ego. It's about how do we get our message that we feel like God's called us to share seen or heard by as many people as possible. I believe in the power of the niche, or as my British friends say, the niche. Stop trying to be the best in the world at what you do. Don't be the best pastor in the world. Don't be the best film director in the world. Because the problem is there's millions of them out there you're competing with. If you really want to get noticed, try to be extraordinary at a small, narrow niche. For instance, I'll give you a great example. My pastor for most of my adult life has been Jack Hayford, Church on the Way here in Van Nuys, California. Jack is brilliant. I think he ought to be the Protestant Pope. But in 20-some years, we raised our daughters at his church, and in 20-some years, I've heard him preach on everything imaginable. However, if you cut Jack, he will bleed worship. He's written 5 worship books. He's written 100 worship songs. You'll remember that song, Majesty. Jack wrote that song, which means that no matter what he preaches, it could be on forgiveness, the resurrection, family issues, finances, whatever he preaches on, he preaches through the lens of worship. And that's what's driven him. It's what he's passionate about. In fact, at Church on the Way, we never had a worship leader. Jack not only preached, he led the worship himself. So when you figure out what that passion is, what that one overarching area is that God's called you to share with the world, you really start becoming the best in the world at that subject. That's when you start getting noticed. In my case, when you go to my blog at philcook.com, I write about the intersection of faith, media, and culture. I don't write about recipes. I don't write about politics. I don't write about sports. Nobody cares what Phil thinks of those things. But I've carved out this space where I have thousands of people that come to my blog every week to hear what I have to say about the issue of faith, media, and culture. And so I think the key thing is understanding that don't be everything to all people. That's not what Paul said in the Scripture. That was about being available to all people. That was not to turn away people. That was a whole different issue. The issue is you cannot be everything to everybody because you can't be an expert at everything. But you can be extraordinary at one big area. Not to sound like a shameless self-promoter, I wrote my book, One Big Thing, to help people figure out what that thing in their life. So I think trying to stop being an expert at everything, start focusing on that one narrow area that you feel you could be extraordinary at. That's the way you'll stand above the crowd and actually get noticed.
Glad that you did mention your book, One Big Thing, Discovering What You Were Born to Do, because just throughout our conversation, that truth can be applied, and that principle of really narrowing your focus and deciding who you are, whether it's a business, what are you there for, what is your story, whether it's as an individual, and like you talked about the addiction of a regular paycheck, if we're just going through the motions in our lives and we don't understand why we have been placed on this earth and what in us is unique that God can use, then we're missing out on an incredible journey. So I'm super excited that you mentioned that specifically. Apply the one big thing to what you just said in terms of your blog. You talk about the intersection of faith, media, and culture. Was there a point in time that you can remember having that aha moment of knowing what your one big thing was that led you to write that book, or how did that unfold?
It was gradual, and it's funny, in the book, I talk about the fact that it's not a mysterious, weird process of trying to figure it out. It's remarkably practical, and as I discovered, it's much more practical than I ever thought, and easy to figure out. But it was a process for me, because I was struggling to go through this whole thing and try to figure it out and go through it. It probably started when I was helping at a conference, Christian media conference, actually, and I was helping behind the scenes. And at the last minute, there was a panel discussion on Christian television. And at the last minute, one of the speakers missed a flight and couldn't be there. And within hours of it starting, they called me and said, hey, would you step up? You're here, you're working, you're helping us behind the scenes. Would you mind taking that guy's place on the panel? So I did. And I realized early on during this discussion, most of the other people on the panel were pastors and ministry leaders. And they talked about big picture things like God's called us to use the media, inspirational kind of things. When it got to me, I said, well, look, if you feel like God's called you to media ministry, let me tell you the 5 or 6 things you need to really think about, the practical stuff you need to think about. And when the panel discussion was over, the other 4 guys were totally ignored, even though they were big national names, and you'd all know all their names. But I probably had 200 people that lined up to talk to me about it. At that moment, a light went on that said, these are sincere people that feel called of God to use media, but they have no clue how to go about it. Man, this was 25, 30 years ago, and that's when I started on this journey to figure out how I can help people really understand. I was already in the business producing programs, and I still do that, but kind of on the side, how can I help people understand how to do that more effectively? And it's grown so that my wife and I launched an organization called the Influence Lab. It's a nonprofit of our own last year, and a key part of that has been doing media training for Christians worldwide. And just in the last year, we've been to Singapore, we've been to South Africa, we've been to Italy, the UK, we've been to Tokyo, we've been all over the world, India 4 times. We've been teaching Christian professionals worldwide how to use the media to share the gospel, and I get invitations constantly to talk about it and teach. So I was kind of thrown into that situation, but the light went on, and we've been following it ever since.
Well, as I was looking at your website, I thought a few more years. I have a 15-year-old daughter who's been involved in videography for about a year and a half now. And when I saw your Influence Lab and was looking at that, I thought, I can't wait to see what the Lord does with that interest that she has. It does sound like a whole generation has been birthed in it, and that you have just been one of the forerunners in that industry. So it'll be exciting to see how that continues to develop. And thank you for all the work you're doing in that industry.
Well, thanks. It's been fun. I mean, God's blessed us enormously, and I love being in the industry, working here in L.A. and Hollywood, because it's not as weird as people think, being a Christian in Hollywood. I mean, after all, there are people in Hollywood that hug trees and worship rocks, so being a Christian is just not that weird. And before we go off the air, I'll tell you that one of the interesting things we've noticed is people can be not interested remotely in being a Christian. In fact, they can be almost hostile toward the Christian faith. But when you offer to pray for them, I've never had anybody turn us down. It's just really a funny thing that people want to be prayed for. They may not be spiritual in any sense. They may not be Christians by any stretch of the imagination, but they're wide open to being prayed for. And I've noticed that that's a great door that can open you up to helping share your faith with somebody that you may be uncomfortable with. I've been on shoots where before we started the shoot, one time I had a young production assistant step up, and it was a secular project, film project, and the first day of shooting, a young intern stepped up and said, would y'all mind if we said a little prayer before we started? And I noticed these big, burly grips and gaffers, these crew guys, fought their way to the front to take somebody's hand to pray. Kind of interesting that in a world that is not necessarily Christian by any means, people love to be prayed for. So it's a good tip for somebody that's trying to maybe open a few doors in their industry.
Phil, thank you so much again for your time. Thank you for the way that you truly do lead like Jesus. For more information on Phil Cooke, check out Phil Cooke, spelled PhilCooke.com. And for information about leadership development training and resources, visit us at leadlikejesus.com. When it comes to leadership, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. There is a perfect model, and we simply need to follow him. Let the leader in you show. Lead like Jesus.